The first time Mabel Baker rode up to Calvin Dawson's ranch, she had dust on her boots, a letter in her hand, and absolutely no idea that the most stubborn man in all of Laramie County, Wyoming Territory, was about to slam the door in her face. It was the spring of 1882, and the land out near the Platte River basin was alive in that particular way it got after a long winter greening at the edges, the sky so wide and blue it felt almost cruel in its beauty. Mabel had traveled 3 days by stagecoach from Cheyenne to get here, and before that she'd ridden a train from Kansas City, where she'd spent the last year working as a seamstress after her father's dry goods store had burned to the ground and taken everything the Baker family had ever built along with it. She was 24 years old, practical, broad-shouldered in spirit if not in body, and she had answered an advertisement in the Cheyenne Leader placed by one Harlan Pierce, land agent, on behalf of a ranch operation seeking a housekeeper and cook for the coming season. The pay was listed as $12 a month plus room and board. For Mabel, $12 a month was the difference between making it and not making it, and she had never been a woman inclined to choose not making it if she could help it. What the advertisement had not mentioned, and what Harlan Pierce had conveniently neglected to tell her during their brief correspondence, was that the man who owned the ranch, Calvin Dawson, 30 years old, the son of a cattle baron who had built up 2,000 acres of Wyoming grassland before dying of a fever in the winter of 1879, had not actually authorized Harlan Pierce to place any advertisement at all. Mabel did not know this when she knocked on the door of the main house, a large, well-constructed ranch house built of pine and stone that sat at the end of a long dirt road lined on one side by a split-rail fence and on the other by a stand of cottonwood trees that were just beginning to go gold at the tips. She knocked with confidence. She had a firm knock. Her mother had always said a firm knock told a person what you were made of before you ever opened your mouth. The door opened after a long pause, and the man who filled the doorframe was not what she had expected. She was not sure what she had expected, something older, perhaps, or softer. What she found instead was a tall man with dark hair that needed cutting, jaw squared and stubbled, dark eyes set beneath brows that were currently drawn together in what could only be described as active suspicion. He was wearing a work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and he had the look of a man who had been interrupted in the middle of something he did not want to be interrupted from. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Calvin Dawson," she said. "Who's asking?" It was not a question, the way he said it. "Mabel Baker. I've come from Cheyenne in response to the advertisement for a housekeeper." She held out the letter, the one from Harlan Pierce that confirmed the position and the terms. "I have written confirmation of the arrangement." He did not take the letter. He looked at it the way a man looks at a thing he already knows is going to cause him trouble. "There is no arrangement," he said. "Harlan Pierce does not speak for this ranch. He said he was your land agent. He handles the sale of timber rights on the eastern parcel. He does not hire my staff." He looked at her once more, something flickering in his expression that was not quite apology but was possibly the precursor to one. "I'm sorry you made the trip. I don't need a housekeeper." He began to close the door. "Mr. Dawson," Mabel said, and there was something in her voice, not anger, not pleading, but a particular kind of firmness that had been forged over a year of hard circumstance, that made him pause. "I have traveled 3 days. I have paid for my own passage on the understanding that I would be reimbursed upon arrival. I have a letter that is signed. Now, I understand you may have a dispute with Mr. Pierce, and I'm willing to acknowledge that dispute is not my fault. But I am standing here in good faith, and the least you can do is tell me to my face that there is truly no work for me here, not hide behind a door." He opened the door a little wider, looked at her. Something in his jaw worked, the way a man's does when he is thinking through a problem he did not ask to have. "There is no work for you here," he said. He said it to her face as requested. Then he went back inside and closed the door, not with a slam but with a quiet, deliberate click that was somehow worse. Mabel stood on the porch for a moment. She looked at the letter in her hand. She looked at the door. She turned, walked back to where her hired horse was tied to the hitching post, and she got on and she rode back toward town, and she was furious the entire way, but she was not crying, because Mabel Baker was not a woman who cried over closed doors. She was, however, a woman who had 12 cents left in her purse, no paid room, and no stage back to Cheyenne until Friday. It was Monday. Harlan Pierce's office was on the main street of the small town of Grazer's Flat, which was the nearest settlement to the Dawson Ranch, about 4 miles west along the River Road. It was a one-street town with a saloon, a general store, a blacksmith, a church, a small hotel, and Harlan Pierce's office above the general store, which Mabel reached by a narrow outside staircase that creaked under her boots. Harlan Pierce was a man in his mid-40s with a tidy mustache and the eyes of someone who was perpetually calculating how much he could get away with. He received Mabel's arrival with practiced surprise and genuine nervousness. "Miss Baker, did Calvin Dawson authorize this position or did he not?" she said, setting the letter on his desk. Harlan Pierce had the grace to look somewhat ashamed. "He may not have been formally consulted," he admitted. "However, I do manage his affairs, and I genuinely believed he would simply accept a stranger arriving at his door. He needs help. Anyone can see that. The man runs that ranch alone. He's been alone up there for 2 years since he let his last hand go," and Harlan stopped himself. "I thought if someone simply arrived, he would see the practicality of it." "He did not see the practicality of it," Mabel said. "He saw me out the door in under 2 minutes, Harlan sighed. He reached into his desk drawer and counted out enough coin to cover her stage fare home. "I am sorry, Miss Baker, truly. I will cover your travel cost and tonight's accommodation." Mabel took the coins. She put them in her purse. She sat down in the chair across from his desk without being invited to, which seemed to surprise him, and she was quiet for a moment while she thought. "Tell me about the ranch," she said. Harlan blinked. "I beg your pardon. Tell me about it. The land, the cattle, the state of the house. You said he's been running it alone for 2 years. Why?" "What happened to his crew?" Harlan studied her with a new kind of attention. "He had a full crew, 3 hands and a cook, when his father left him the place. After the first winter, he let them all go, one by one. Paid them well, no bad blood from what I understand, just sent them away. He's been managing alone since the spring of 1880. It's a working operation. He keeps cattle, does some horse breaking on the side, but there's only so much one man can do." "And the house?" Harlan cleared his throat. "I haven't been inside in some time, but I understand it is functional." "Functional," Mabel repeated. "Clean enough, but sparse. He's a practical man." "He's a stubborn man," Mabel said. "That too," Harlan agreed. She spent that night in the hotel, a small room over the dining room that smelled of tallow candles and was nonetheless the most private space she had had in months. She lay on the narrow bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about $12 a month. She thought about the way Calvin Dawson had looked at her, not unkindly, that was the thing. There had been no meanness in his face. There had been something else, something guarded, like a window with the curtains drawn from the inside. The next morning she rose before sunrise, ate the bread and coffee the hotel owner's wife set out, and then she did something that perhaps was not entirely rational but felt entirely necessary. She hired a horse again and rode back up the river road to the Dawson Ranch. The second time Mabel Baker came to Calvin Dawson's door, he was in the yard splitting firewood when she rode up, and he stopped mid-swing when he saw her, and the expression on his face was one she would remember for a long time, pure, honest disbelief, followed immediately by something that might have been the beginning of amusement before he got control of it. He set the axe down. He waited. She dismounted and tied the horse and walked to within 10 feet of him, which felt like a reasonable distance for a negotiation. "I'm not here about the job," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "Not exactly. I'm here to make you a proposal, a business one." He crossed his arms. He was wearing the same work shirt as yesterday, and she suspected that had nothing to do with carelessness and everything to do with the fact that he simply did not have anyone to tell him to change it. "Go ahead," he said. "Harlan Pierce owes me 3 days of travel and a night's accommodation, which he has paid. But the fact remains that he advertised a position that brought me here under false pretenses, and in doing so he has cost me time and opportunity. I could write to the Cheyenne leader about that. I am not threatening to, I am simply noting that I could, and that it would be damaging to his reputation as a land agent." Calvin Dawson said nothing. He was listening. "However, I don't want to do that. What I want is work, and I'm good at it. I can cook, I can keep house, I can mend, I can manage stores and keep accounts. I grew up in a dry goods store and I kept the books from the time I was 14. I am not here because I am desperate for just any position. I am here because Harlan Pierce told me about this place and I think it is a good situation, and I think you need someone, whether you are willing to admit it or not." He looked at her for a long moment. The spring wind moved across the yard between them, carrying the smell of the river and new grass. "I don't need anyone," he said. "That is what people say when they need someone most," she replied. His jaw tightened. "Miss Baker," his voice was careful now, deliberate. "I don't know what Harlan told you about this ranch or about me, but whatever it was, I can tell you that he was selling you something you don't want to buy. This is a hard place. The winters are long and the work doesn't stop, and I am not easy company. I'm telling you this for your own good. I have survived hard places before," she said. "Good. Then you'll survive going back to Cheyenne." He picked up the axe again. He was done. The conversation was over as far as he was concerned. Mabel looked at him for one more moment. Looked at the ranch house, at the fence that needed 2 rails replaced, at the kitchen garden alongside the south wall that had gone to weed over the winter and clearly hadn't been turned yet. She looked at the man with the axe who was the loneliest person she had seen in a very long time, though he would never have said so out loud. "All right," she said. "I'll go." She got back on the horse and rode back to town. She did not go home to Kansas City. She took a room at a boarding house run by a woman named Della Marsh, who was 50 years old and had the forearms of a woman who had done real labor her entire life, and the eyes of someone who found most things faintly amusing. Mabel explained her situation over supper, which was salt pork and fried cornmeal and was excellent. Della listened without interrupting. "Calvin Dawson," Della said when Mabel was done. "His father was a good man, knew him for years. Cal grew up on that land. After Thomas died, the boy just closed up, like a fist." She shook her head. "He had a woman, you know, before his father passed. Girl named Rosalie Fenwick from over near Laramie. I think she was meant to come out and be his wife, but then Thomas died and Calvin sent her away too. Told her it wasn't the right time. That was 3 years ago. He just sent her away. That's what I heard, and she went. And he's been alone up there ever since." Della poured more coffee into both their cups. "He's not a bad man. He's just scared, I think, though he'd sooner eat his hat than admit it." Mabel turned this over in her mind. She thought about a man who had sent everyone away, one by one, and whether there was a specific reason for it or whether it was just grief, operating the only way grief sometimes knows how to. She got a job in the meantime, helping in the kitchen of the Grazer's Flat Hotel, and she stayed at Della's boarding house, and she spent her evenings reading or talking with Della, who turned out to be one of the finest people Mabel had ever met. 2 weeks passed, then 3. She found out more about Calvin Dawson in the natural way you find things out about people in small towns, which is to say that people tell you without your having to ask. She learned that he had grown up partly educated by his mother, who had died when he was 12, and then by a series of tutors his father had brought out. She learned that he was regarded as fair and honest in his business dealings, that he had never been in a fight at the saloon, and that he came to town every 2 weeks or so for supplies, and spent as little time in the company of others as he could manage before riding back up the river road. She learned that his cattle were good quality, and that he knew horses the way some men knew music, instinctively and deeply. She also learned, from the blacksmith's wife, that his roof had been leaking since a heavy snowstorm in February had knocked loose several shingles, and that he had been sleeping in the back room on the ground floor since then. She learned this on a Tuesday, and by Thursday morning she had loaded herself onto the borrowed horse again with a basket of food she had put together, a proper meal, roasted chicken and cornbread, and a jar of apple preserves that Della had given her from her own cellar, and she rode back up the river road for the third time. He was in the pasture when she arrived, moving cattle with the help of a single horse, doing the work of 2 men by himself. He did not see her at first. She tied her horse and sat on the fence and watched him work for a while, because she was not above admitting to herself that he was very good at it. He worked with his horse in the way Della had described him, with horses like they were speaking to each other, like the horse understood not just his commands but his intentions. Eventually, he circled back toward the fence and saw her sitting there, and he pulled up short, and for a full 5 seconds he simply stared at her. "Good morning," she said. He removed his hat, ran a hand through his hair, put the hat back. "Miss Baker, I brought dinner," she said, "an early one. I thought you might not have had a proper meal today." He looked at the basket. She could see him wanting to refuse, and she could see the same thing in him that she had seen the first time and the second time, that guardedness, that careful self-containment, but under it something that was exhausted by its own effort. "It's not a bribe," she added. "It's just food. I made too much and Della Marsh doesn't need any more chicken." He dismounted and tied his horse to the fence post. He came around to where she was sitting and he looked at the basket and then at her, and she let him look, and she did not try to fill the silence. "Why do you keep coming back?" he said. It was not a hostile question. It was a genuine one. "Because the first time you sent me away I had good reason to leave. The second time I came back because I had something to say, and I said it, and I respect that you made your choice. This time I came back because," she paused, choosing honesty over strategy, "because I've been thinking about you, and I think you've been thinking about me, and I'm not in the habit of walking away from things that are worth staying for." He looked at her for a long time. A meadowlark called somewhere out in the pasture. The wind moved across the grass in that way it did in Wyoming, in long, rolling sighs. "You barely know me," he said. "I know enough," she said, "and I'd like to know more, over dinner if you're willing." He stood there for another moment, and Mabel could almost see the debate happening behind his eyes, the part of him that wanted to send her away again doing battle with the part of him that was so deeply tired of doing exactly that. And then something in him shifted, subtle as a change in weather, and he moved toward the gate and held it open. "Come on then," he said. "There's a table on the back porch that gets the afternoon sun." It was not much, as invitations went. But it was the door opening instead of closing, and Mabel picked up her basket and followed him, and she felt something loosen in her chest that she had not known was tight. They ate on the back porch in the afternoon light, with the pasture spread out below them and the Platte River gleaming in the distance, and it was not a graceful meal. He was rusty at conversation in the way a man is who has talked to no one but cattle and horses for 2 years. He asked short questions and answered in fewer words than she used, and there were stretches of silence that a more nervous person might have rushed to fill but that Mabel let sit, because she had grown up in a household where silence was not a problem to be solved, but a thing that had its own texture. She told him about the dry goods store, about her father, who was a good and decent man now staying with her brother in Kansas City, and slowly finding his way through the grief of the fire. She told him about Kansas City, about the seamstress work, about the way the city had felt suffocating after growing up in a smaller town. He told her, haltingly, about the cattle business, about the calving season which was ongoing and was keeping him up nights, about the fence on the north quarter that had taken some storm damage over the winter. He did not talk about his father. He did not talk about Rosalie Fenwick, but he listened to her with a quality of attention that she had not often encountered in men, a fullness of listening that felt like a form of respect. When the food was gone, he said, somewhat awkwardly, "It was a good meal." "Thank you," she said. Another silence. The sun was getting long and golden across the grass. "The roof's been leaking," he said, almost against his will. "Back corner of the upstairs hall." "I heard," she said. He looked at her sharply. From Delamarche, I suppose. News travels in small towns. He leaned back in his chair and looked out at the pasture. I'll get to it when calving's done. I could help with the calving, she said. He looked at her. I grew up on the edge of cattle country. My father sold feed and supplies to ranchers for 20 years. I've helped with a difficult birth more than once. She met his gaze. I'm not asking to be hired. I'm asking to be useful because I can see you need it and because I've been going out of my mind sitting in Delamarche's kitchen waiting for Friday's stage. Why haven't you taken Friday's stage? He said. There have been 2. Because I didn't want to, she said plainly. He looked at her with that deep, careful attention again. There was something in his eyes, something that was not quite hope but was the ground on which hope might eventually grow. 1 week, he said at last. Trial arrangement. You take the room at the east end of the upstairs, the roof's fine there. We renegotiate after the week. $12 a month, she said. 10, he said. 11, she said. Fine, he said, and something at the corner of his mouth moved almost imperceptibly, the ghost of a smile that was there, and gone so fast she might have imagined it. She moved her things from Delamarche's the next morning. Della helped her pack, looking at her with the particular expression of a woman who understands something the younger woman does not quite yet. He's worth it, Della said, wrapping a tin cup in a cloth. He just doesn't know it himself yet. The first week was a kind of careful, tentative negotiation conducted mostly through proximity. Mabel rose before dawn and had the stove going and coffee made by the time Calvin came in from the first morning check on the cattle. He acknowledged this without commentary, which she took to mean approval. She cleaned the kitchen properly for the first time in what was evidently a long while, found the stores organized in a way that made sense to her in concept, but had been executed somewhat haphazardly, and reorganized them with a note to herself to ask before reorganizing anything that was his system and not just neglect. The house itself was large and solidly built, and as Harlan Pierce had said, functional. The main room held a good stone fireplace and a table long enough for 6. There was a front parlor that had the look of a room not used in a long time, the furniture under dust cloths, a writing desk with papers stacked in a neat but long untouched pile. Upstairs there were 4 bedrooms, his at the far end of the hall and hers at the other, and in between them a narrow hall with a window that looked east over the cottonwood trees. She found, in the parlor, a photograph on the mantelpiece. A man who was clearly Calvin's father, from the resemblance, standing before the house in what must have been the late 1870s, looking directly at the camera with a kind of solid dignity. Beside it was a smaller picture of a woman and a boy, and the boy had Calvin's eyes. She understood a great deal from those photographs. She did not mention them. The calving work was real and hard, and she was glad she had offered. 3 nights that first week saw difficult births, and Calvin came to find her at 2 in the morning because the heifer he'd been watching had gotten herself into trouble, and Mabel pulled on her coat and her boots and went out into the cold with him without complaint, and she was steady and useful and did not faint or carry on, which seemed to settle something in his estimation of her. They worked side by side in the lantern light of the barn, and there was no room for awkwardness in that kind of work, no room for the careful distances they were otherwise maintaining. He talked to her practically and directly, and she answered the same way, and afterward when the calf was on its feet and they were washing up at the water trough in the cold spring air, he looked at her with something that was simply honest. "You were right," he said. "I needed the help." "I know," she said. And she did not make him feel anything about that because there was nothing to make him feel. It was just the truth, and she liked the truth, and she thought maybe he did too. By the end of the first week, he said nothing about renegotiating, and she took that as the arrangement being settled. She wrote to her father in Kansas City to let him know she had a good position and was well. She did not mention Calvin Dawson except as her employer, because there was nothing else to say yet, though she was beginning to think there might be something else to say eventually. The month of May in Wyoming Territory in 1882 was extraordinary. The grasslands came fully alive, and the Platte ran high and quick with snowmelt from the mountains to the west, and the ranch took on a kind of settled beauty that had nothing to do with any improvements she had made and everything to do with the land itself and the season. She walked the property in the evenings sometimes after the supper dishes were done, and once Calvin found her at the far fence watching the sun go down over the river, and he came and stood beside her without saying anything for a long time. "My father built that fence," he said eventually, nodding at the post she was leaning against. "He built a lot of this himself. He was that kind of man." "What kind?" she asked. "The kind who built things, who believed in building." He was quiet again. "I think after he died I stopped believing in that for a while." It was the most personal thing he had said to her. She did not treat it as fragile. "And now?" she asked. He looked out at the river. "Now I think maybe building is just what you do. Whether you believe in it or not, you just have to keep doing it." She looked at his profile in the evening light. "That sounds like your father talking." He turned to look at her, surprised. Then something in his face relaxed, softened in a way she had not seen it do before. "Maybe it is," he said. They walked back to the house together in the blue dusk, their footsteps in the grass, the first stars appearing, and Mabel thought she had never in her life felt the particulars of a moment so precisely. The summer came in hard and bright. Calvin hired one ranch hand for the season, a young man named Pete Harlow, 17 and eager, the son of a family that had a small homestead to the south. Pete was good-natured and worked hard and regarded Mabel with straightforward friendliness, and Calvin with unconcealed hero worship, which seemed to both embarrass and please Calvin in equal measure. Having Pete around changed the dynamic of the ranch in a small but noticeable way. It was less just the two of them, and there were meals at the table for three and evenings where Pete would sit on the porch and try to learn the harmonica, which he was dreadful at, and which made even Calvin's most composed expression strain toward laughter. On a Saturday evening in July, Calvin drove the wagon into Grazer's flat for supplies, and Mabel went with him, which was the first time she had been back to town since she had moved to the ranch. Della Marsh saw her across the main street and practically ran over, and they embraced on the boardwalk while Calvin loaded the wagon at the general store, and Della talked and laughed and looked at Calvin over Mabel's shoulder with an expression of deep satisfaction. There was a small summer dance that evening at the schoolhouse, announced by a hand-lettered sign on the general store door. Della pushed Mabel toward it with both hands, metaphorically speaking. "You have to go. You've been on that ranch for 3 months and you need to dance Mabel Baker." "I don't think Calvin dances," Mabel said. "Ask him," Della said. Mabel thought about this for the entire afternoon, and then when they had loaded the wagon and Calvin was checking the horses' harnessing, she said, without particular prelude, "There's a dance tonight at the schoolhouse. Would you like to go?" He paused with his hand on the harness. "I don't go to dances much," he said. "Neither do I lately," she said. "But I think I'd like to." He looked at her. The afternoon sun was strong and she was wearing her blue dress, the good one because she had planned ahead, and she saw his eyes move over her with a new kind of attention, different from the practical, working-day regard she was used to from him, something with more warmth in it. "All right," he said. The dance was held in the schoolhouse, which was a single room swept clean, with the desks pushed back and a fiddler and a banjo player who knew what they were doing. Most of Grazer's flat and the surrounding farms and ranches were there, and Mabel was introduced to a great many people in a short time, and she noticed that Calvin was somewhat stiff at first, in the way of a man not accustomed to social gatherings, but people were glad to see him and said so simply and directly, because that was the way of small communities, and gradually the stiffness eased. He did not dance for the first hour. He stood with her at the edge of the room and talked or listened, and brought her a cup of apple cider, and she thought about how much she liked standing beside him, liked the way he occupied space with a kind of quiet gravity, a steadiness. Then the fiddler shifted into a waltz, and Mabel turned to him and held out her hand, and he looked at it for a moment and then he took it. He was a better dancer than she had expected. Not showy, not effortless, but solid and present, leading properly, his hand at her waist with a pressure that was neither too tentative nor presumptuous, but exactly right. She looked up at him and he was looking at her, and the room was all around them with its light and noise, but it felt, in that particular way that moments sometimes do, as if they were the only ones standing still. "You can dance," she said. "My mother taught me," he said. "She said a man who couldn't dance was only half a man." She was right, he smiled. A real one this time, not the ghost of one. It changed his face in the way that a genuine smile always changes a face, opened it, made it warm and entirely different from its closed-off version, and Mabel felt something in her chest take a decided step forward without asking her permission. They danced twice more before they drove back to the ranch, and on the road home, with Pete asleep in the wagon bed and the stars enormous overhead, she sat beside Calvin on the wagon seat close enough that their arms touched, and neither of them moved away, and the night was sweet and warm with the smell of sage and river water, and they said very little, and it was one of the best hours she had spent in recent memory. August was long and hot and full of work. There was fencing to do, and a section of the barn roof that needed shoring up, and the kitchen garden was producing more than she could manage alone. So she put up preserves until the shelves of the cool room were full and sent jars to Della and to the church for the community box. Calvin worked from before sunup to after sundown most days, and she matched his hours, and they developed between them a rhythm that was comfortable and efficient and felt, to her at least, like more than just working in the same place. She knew he was watching her, in the way she had learned to know things about him, through small signals, through the particular quality of his attention. She would look up from kneading bread to find him in the doorway of the kitchen, not quite watching her, but also not quite not. And he would say something practical about supper or the day's work, and she would answer practically. And they would both carry the other thing along with them unsaid, which was what they were both apparently doing, and which Mabel was beginning to find more amusing than frustrating. Della Marsh came out to the ranch in early September to help with the apple picking, because there was a good old tree at the southeast corner of the house that Calvin's father had planted and that gave abundantly in good years, and this was a good year. They picked all afternoon, Della and Mabel working through the tree with baskets, talking and laughing, and Calvin came by once and Della said to him, perfectly pleasantly and without apparent agenda, "She's remarkable, Calvin, in case you hadn't noticed." Calvin looked at Della, looked at Mabel. Mabel was looking up into the tree and pretending she hadn't heard, which she suspected fooled neither of them. "I noticed," he said, and walked on. Mabel climbed down from the ladder and looked at Della with an expression she intended to be composed. Della was grinning. "You should tell him," she said. "Tell him what?" Mabel said. "Whatever you've been not telling him all summer," Della said. Mabel looked after Calvin, who had disappeared around the corner of the barn. She thought about what she would say. She had been thinking about it for weeks, the shape of it, how to say the thing that was true without making it into a demand, because the last thing she wanted to do was push him back behind that closed door. That evening after supper, Pete excused himself early. She suspected Della had somehow communicated with him. She would not put it past Della, and it was just the two of them at the table with the lamp lit and the night sounds coming through the open window, and Mabel set down her coffee cup and said without prelude, "I think you should know that I'm not here just for the position." Calvin looked up from the table. "I came back 3 times, she said. "I want to be honest with you about why. The first time was for the work. The second time was also for the work, or so I told myself. The third time," she paused. "The third time I came back because of you, and I've stayed because of you. And if that is not something you want, then I'll respect it, and I'll stay as long as the work is useful, and then I'll go, and that will be all right. But I am not willing to keep not saying it, because I've never been that kind of person." The lamp flame moved in the draft from the window. Outside, a coyote called somewhere far out across the flats. Calvin was very still. He was looking at her with that particular quality of his full attention, and she could see him working through something, working through the wall he'd built, working with the specific tool of what she had just said. "I sent everyone away," he said. His voice was low. "After my father died. There wasn't a reason I could name, it just felt like the right thing, felt like what I deserved, to be alone with it. With the grief," she said. "With all of it, the grief, the failing. I felt like I'd failed him somehow, though he died of a fever and there was nothing to fail at. It wasn't rational." He looked at his hands on the table. "I sent Rosalie away too. She was a good woman and I sent her away because I thought I would ruin whatever she had if she was attached to me." "You were wrong," Mabel said gently. "I know that now," he said. "It took me a long time to know it." He looked up at her. "You came back 3 times. I did. And the 3rd time I didn't send you away." "No," she said. "You didn't." He was quiet for a moment. Then he stood up from the table and came around it and stood in front of her, and she looked up at him, and his face was entirely open in a way she had never seen it, no guard, no careful distance, just him, just the man, and he was afraid and certain in the same breath. "I don't want to send you away again," he said. "I don't think I could even if I wanted to, and I don't want to." He reached out and took her hand from the table, his rough fingers closing around hers, and it was the first deliberate touch between them, and it was so quiet and so significant that she felt it somewhere well below the surface. "Then don't," she said. He sat down beside her, and they held onto each other's hands in the lamplight like two people who had found something at the end of a long crossing. And they talked for 3 hours, really talked. The kind of talking that tears down walls. And he told her about his father and the grief and Rosalie. And she told him about the fire and the year alone in Kansas City, and the way she had arrived in Wyoming with 12 cents and a stubborn heart. And sometime in the middle of all that talking, he tucked a strand of hair behind her ear with the same hand that had been holding hers, and it was such a gentle, unself-conscious gesture that she felt her eyes sting briefly, which she managed to conceal by turning to pour more coffee. The autumn came on in a blaze of color that turned the cottonwood trees to gold. Mabel had never seen a Wyoming fall before, and it undid her completely, the dramatic beauty of it, and she said so to Calvin one morning when they were riding the fence line on the north quarter, and the whole world was gold and blue, and the air was sharp as a clean blade. "Wait until you see it snow," he said. She looked at him. "Are you expecting me to still be here when it snows?" He turned in the saddle and looked at her with an expression of mild exasperation that was one of her new favorite things about him. "I'm hoping you will be," he said. "I'm expecting you will be. There is a difference." "That is the most romantic thing you have ever said to me," she said. He laughed, a real laugh, full and warm, the kind she had been working toward since spring, and the sound of it rang across the open land and startled a pair of red-winged blackbirds up out of the grass, and she thought she would remember that laugh for the rest of her life. In late October, on a Sunday after church, they had started going to church together, which caused a gentle, affectionate stir in Grazer's flat. He stopped the wagon on the road home and turned to her with an expression that was focused and a little solemn. "I want to ask you something," he said. "All right," she said. He reached into his coat pocket and took out a ring, small and simple, a band of silver with a single turquoise stone set in it, and she recognized it as belonging to his mother, because she had seen it in the upstairs jewelry box she had found while cleaning, and the fact that it was his mother's made something in her throat go tight. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said, "and I want to say before I do that I know I am difficult and that I am better at silence than conversation, and that I spent 2 years being very stupid about being alone. I know that you deserve someone who makes things easy, and I can't promise I will always make things easy, but I can promise you the ranch and the land and every year of work I have in me, and I can promise that I will never send you away again. Not ever. Not for any reason." He looked at her steadily. "Mabel Baker, will you marry me?" The cottonwood trees were gold around them. The sky was the deep clear blue of late October. The river was audible somewhere below, running over the flat stones. "Yes," she said. And then, because she was Mabel Baker and she was honest above all things, "I have wanted to say yes for a very long time." He slid the ring onto her finger and then he kissed her, there on the wagon seat on the river road. A proper kiss, warm and certain. And she put her hand against his jaw the way she had imagined doing since the spring. And the horses waited patiently, and the gold leaves drifted down around them. And it was, by any reasonable standard, entirely perfect. They were married in November, at the church in Grazer's Flat, on a cold, bright Saturday when the first snow had dusted the plains overnight, and everything was white and clean and sharply new. Della Marsh stood beside Mabel, and Pete Harlow stood beside Calvin, and Harlan Pierce sat in the third pew looking pleased with himself in the way of a man who considers himself responsible for a happy outcome, despite the fact that his involvement had been questionable at best. Mabel looked at him once during the ceremony and thought that she would probably forgive him entirely eventually, and that this was a sign of good character on her part. Calvin said his vows in the quiet, direct way he said everything, looking at her with steady dark eyes, and she said hers back, and the minister pronounced them married, and Calvin kissed her with everyone watching, and she felt absolutely no embarrassment about it whatsoever. The wedding supper was held in Della's house, which was the largest private home in Grazer's Flat, and Della had cooked for 2 days. There was roast beef and gravy, 3 kinds of pie, and someone had brought a keg of decent beer, and the fiddler from the summer dance was there, and they cleared the parlor furniture back. Calvin danced with her 3 times, which was twice more than he had ever danced with anyone at a public gathering, which Della told her afterward in a tone of great significance. They drove home in the dark in the cold under the winter stars, and the ranch house had warm light in the windows because Pete had left a fire going for them. And when Calvin helped her down from the wagon and they walked to the door, he paused on the porch and looked out at the land, the snow-covered pasture, the dark silver ribbon of the river, the vast black sky with its 1,000 cold stars, and she saw on his face something she had not seen there before, something at rest. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him. "I'm thinking my father would have been glad," he said. "He would have been," she agreed. They went inside and the fire was good, and that was their wedding night, and it was everything it should be, quiet and warm and honest, which was the only way either of them knew how to be. The winter was hard, as Wyoming winters always were, but the house held and the cattle survived well, and Mabel learned the particular art of ranch winter, which was different from any other kind of waiting she had experienced. It was not passive. It was the steady, ongoing work of maintenance and care, of keeping things alive until the season turned. She and Calvin were well suited to it, it turned out, because they were both people who understood the value of steady effort and who did not need constant distraction. They read in the evenings, often with the lamp between them on the table, each with their book or their mending or Calvin with his account ledgers, and she had developed the habit of reading aloud from whatever she was reading when she found something interesting, and he had developed the habit of responding to these readings with what she came to recognize as genuine engagement, though his commentary was always brief and precise. He was funnier than she had expected, in a dry, quiet way that only revealed itself once she had been around him long enough to catch it. He made her laugh in the way she liked to be made to laugh, unexpectedly, from something genuinely observed. She thought sometimes about the man she had met on the doorstep that first day, and how completely she had not understood him yet, and how the process of understanding had been one of the most interesting things she had ever undertaken. In February, she wrote to her father and told him, fully now, about Calvin and the ranch and the marriage, and she invited him to come visit in the spring. Her father wrote back a long letter in his careful hand, expressing joy and relief and a great deal of fatherly sentiment that made her sit at the kitchen table with the letter in her lap and her eyes warm. Calvin found her like that and said, "What is it?" And she handed him the letter and he read it and handed it back and said, he should come in May. The place looks its best in May." And she looked at him and thought that this was one of the ways she loved him, this particular practical tenderness. And she did love him, fully and certainly, and in all the specific details of who he was, not the idea of him but the actual man. Spring came again, and with it Mabel's father, Arthur Baker, who was 61 years old and had kind eyes and had rebuilt himself after the fire into something leaner and more deliberate. He arrived on the Friday stage, and Mabel met him at the Grazer's Flat Depot with the wagon, and when she saw him walking toward her, she felt the kind of happiness that is made partly of relief, the relief of someone you love still being there, still coming toward you. Arthur Baker shook Calvin's hand at supper that first evening, and then looked at him steadily over the table and said, "My daughter is the best person I know. I want you to know I believe she is in good hands." Calvin met his gaze with equal steadiness. "She is," he said, "and she is also the best person I know." Arthur Baker smiled. "Well," he said, "that settles that." Arthur stayed 2 weeks, and in that time something easy and warm grew up between him and Calvin, the kind of friendship between men that is based on a shared interest in doing things properly in the land, in the long, slow work of building something. They rode the property together, and Arthur asked intelligent questions about cattle management, and Calvin answered them without condescension. And she watched from the kitchen window one afternoon as the two of them stood by the south fence talking. And she felt a deep and specific gratitude for the way life, sometimes, resolved itself better than you had any right to expect. Pete Harlow came back for the summer season, and Calvin had also hired an experienced hand named Gus Freely, who was 40-something and laconic and excellent at his work. And the ranch had a different feel that season, full, purposeful, the feel of a place that was actively becoming. Mabel had begun to think about the kitchen garden with more ambition, extending it southward, and had ordered seeds from the catalog that came through Harlan Pierce's office, including some that were experimental for the altitude and climate, but that she intended to try anyway. She was 3 months along with their first child by the time Calvin knew about it, because she had wanted to be certain before she said anything, which was perhaps not entirely fair to him. And she acknowledged this when she finally told him, sitting on the back porch on a June evening, saying it plainly and directly as she did everything. He was very still for a moment. Then he looked at her with an expression that she had to look away from because it was so entirely unguarded, so purely joyful, that it felt almost private. "Mabel," he said, and her name in his voice sounded like it contained many other things. "I should have told you sooner," she said. "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry," he said. He reached over and took her hand. "When?" "December, probably early December." He was quiet, holding her hand, looking out at the ranch. The summer evening was long and golden. "A winter baby," he said. "You'll have to see to the fire more often," she said. "I will see to the fire more often," he said with absolute certainty. She laughed, and he turned and kissed her hair, and she leaned against him on the porch. And the evening went on around them, warm and alive. The pregnancy was healthy, though the summer heat was more trying than usual, and she handed more of the heavier cooking off to Pete, who had discovered an unexpected aptitude for cornbread and stew, and who seemed genuinely pleased to be useful in this way. Calvin was attentive in his particular style, which did not include hovering or excessive anxiety, but did include a series of very practical acts. A better chair for the table, a different arrangement for the water barrel so she didn't have to lift it, and a new curtain for the east bedroom window that stopped the morning sun from waking her. She loved him for all of these things so specifically that she sometimes told him so, and he received these declarations with a pleasure that was genuine but never quite comfortable, which was another thing she loved about him. Autumn came. Her father wrote monthly now. Della Marsh came to the ranch regularly and had appointed herself the kind of helpfully opinionated female relative that Mabel had been missing since her mother had passed 10 years earlier. Della had opinions about confinement and delivery that she expressed freely, and Calvin mostly vacated the kitchen when these conversations were happening, though Mabel noted that he listened from the hallway, which she found touching. The baby came on the 8th of December, during a snowstorm that had been blowing in from the northwest for 2 days. Della had been at the ranch for a week, having made the decision that no weather was going to prevent her being there, and it was Della who managed the birth along with Mabel's own considerable determination, and it was Calvin who paced the main room floor for 4 hours until Della came to the door and said, "Come in now, Calvin." He came in, and there she was on the bed, tired and sure of herself, and holding a baby who was red and crumpled and unmistakably present. And Calvin sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby and then at Mabel, and his face was completely without defense of any kind. "A boy," Della said, unnecessarily. "A good, strong boy." Calvin looked at his son. He reached out one careful finger, and the baby's hand, without apparent volition, closed around it. "Thomas," Calvin said. He looked at Mabel. "If that is all right." "Thomas," she said. "Yes." He leaned down and pressed his forehead very gently to hers, and it was the sort of moment that does not require language, that exists entirely in itself. Thomas Arthur Dawson was healthy and loudly opinionated from his first day, and had, everyone agreed, his father's eyes and his mother's chin, and the combination was entirely charming. He slept in the front room in the cradle that Calvin had made over the fall from the good pine boards that had been sitting in the barn since the previous year, sanded to silk smoothness, constructed with the same careful precision Calvin brought to every physical task. Mabel recovered well and quickly, which surprised no one who knew her, and by February was back to full operation of the house. Winter now meant something different. It meant Thomas in the morning light learning to focus his eyes. It meant Calvin reading aloud in the evenings with the baby on his chest. It meant the household grown by one small and enormously significant person. In the spring, Mabel wrote to her brother Joseph in Kansas City to tell him about Thomas and the ranch, and she described the land in May, the grass and the river and the wide sky, and she found as she was writing it that she was describing home. Not Kansas City, which was where she had come from, but here, this specific land, these 2,000 acres along the Platte, Calvin's father's fence and Calvin's mother's apple tree and the back porch in the afternoon sun. Home, precisely and permanently. The second year of their marriage opened out like the land itself in good weather, expansive and full of possibility. Calvin expanded the cattle operation, purchasing additional breeding stock from a rancher north of Laramie, whose reputation for quality he respected, and the transaction required 2 days in Laramie, which was the first time they had been separated since the wedding, and which he was not entirely happy about, and she sent him off with food for the road, and a letter in his coat pocket that she had written the night before that said what she felt, plainly and without evasion. And when he came back, he had the letter still in his coat pocket, and he told her so without being asked, and she thought this was quite the most satisfying thing. Pete Harlow came back each spring and had now been hired on as a permanent hand, having decided that ranching was what he wanted, and he was growing into it with a dedication that Calvin recognized and nurtured, teaching him with the same focused patience with which he did everything. Gus Freely was a permanent fixture too, and the ranch had the feel of a genuine going concern, something substantial and ongoing. In the summer of their second year, there was trouble with a neighboring claim. A man named Vickers who had homesteaded the parcel to the east of the Dawson fence line, and who had been allowing his cattle to drift across the boundary and graze the Dawson pasture. It was not a violent conflict, but it was a persistent and aggravating one, and Calvin had spoken to Vickers twice with no resolution. Mabel suggested bringing it to the county land office in Laramie, which she said in a tone that made it clear she had already researched this course of action and was reasonably certain of its outcome. Calvin looked at her with the expression of a man who appreciates competence and finds it particularly attractive in this specific form. "You've already written to them," he said. "I've drafted a letter," she said. "It needs your signature. He read it. It was thorough, clear, and legally sound, incorporating the land descriptions from the original deed in language that was precise without being aggressive. "Where did you learn to write like this?" he said. "My father kept 20 years of business correspondence," she said. "I read all of it." He signed the letter. The matter was resolved through the county office within 6 weeks. The boundary was formally resurveyed, and Vickers ceased to be a problem. Calvin, who had grown up in a legal environment where men solved land disputes with rifles, was quietly and thoroughly impressed. Thomas was walking by the time he was a year old, which seemed to give him enormous personal satisfaction, and he pursued his ambulation with the concentrated determination of both his parents and at a speed that kept Mabel in a state of constant alert. He loved the barn, loved the horses, loved the cattle with a fearlessness that made Calvin watch him carefully, and with a pride he could barely contain. "He's your father's child," Mabel told Calvin one afternoon, watching Thomas try to feed a handful of grass to the calmest of the draft horses, who accepted this offering with dignified patience. "That's what Thomas would have done." Calvin was quiet beside her. "Yes," he said, "I think so." She slid her hand into his. He held it in the way he always did, firmly and without thought, as if this were simply what hands were for. The second summer Della Marsh got sick. It was not a dramatic illness but a slow one, a lung complaint that Della managed with her characteristic practical humor, but that Mabel watched with concern. She went to town to see Della twice a week, and Calvin drove her without comment and waited or ran his errands and came back. And on the evenings when she returned quiet and worried, he sat with her and let her be quiet and worried, which was what she needed, and he was good at this, at the particular skill of presence without pressure. Della recovered through the autumn, slowly and stubbornly, and by October was nearly herself again, and Mabel felt the relief of this in her whole body. She told Della so. "You fussed over me very nicely," Della said, sitting up in her parlor chair with her coffee cup and looking considerably improved. "I fuss when I care about someone," Mabel said. "You should be used to it by now." "Calvin never fussed," Della observed. "Calvin drove me here twice a week without being asked," Mabel said. "That's his version of fussing," Della smiled. "You understand him very well." "I understand him better every day," Mabel said, "and every day there is more to understand." "That is the best kind of marriage," Della said, "the kind where there is always more to understand." By the autumn of 1884, 2 years after their wedding, Mabel knew she was expecting again. This time she told Calvin the same week she was certain, sitting down at the kitchen table after supper while Thomas was already asleep in his room, saying, "I should tell you sooner this time, so I'm telling you now." His face did the same thing it had done the first time, that complete openness, that pure warmth, and she thought she would never get entirely used to it, which was exactly right. "June," she said. "A summer baby," he said. "You'll have to manage without me for a bit during haying." "I'll manage," he said and smiled. Their second child was born in late June of 1885, a daughter this time, smaller than Thomas had been but equally determined, with hair the color of dark honey and her mother's green eyes. They named her Clara Ruth, Ruth for Calvin's mother, whose name he had never spoken aloud but whose photograph was still on the mantelpiece, and when Mabel suggested it, he had looked at her as if she had given him something he hadn't known he needed. Clara was different from Thomas in the way that children are always different from each other and entirely themselves from the start, quieter, more observant, watching the world from her first months with a thoughtful intensity that both parents recognized and found deeply familiar. Thomas, who was 2 years old and very serious about his position as the firstborn, inspected his sister with the gravity of a small official and then announced, "She's little." This was accurate. After further observation over several days, he amended his opinion to, "She's all right," which was high praise from Thomas, and which made Calvin look at the ceiling and swallow something that was not strictly practical. The ranch continued to grow. Calvin added a new section to the barn in 1885, and extended the kitchen garden again in the spring of 1886 at Mabel's direction. And the household was full in a way it had never been during the years of his solitude, full with noise and intention, and the daily traffic of a family at work in a place they loved. Arthur Baker came to visit every year now, staying for 2 or 3 weeks in the spring, and he and Calvin had become something genuine and good, the older man and the younger one with the fatherless years between them, finding in each other a useful and warmly felt companionship. Calvin listened to Arthur the way he listened to very few people, with full attention and genuine consideration, and Arthur had opinions about cattle breeding that, after 2 years of listening, Calvin had discovered were actually quite sound. Harlan Pierce ran into Mabel in the Grazer's Flat General Store one afternoon in the fall of 1886 and said, with an earnestness that seemed entirely uncharacteristic, "I am glad it worked out, Mrs. Dawson, truly glad." He fidgeted with his hat. "I know I went about it badly." Mabel considered him for a moment. He was older now and slightly less calculating around the eyes, which age sometimes did to a person if they were paying attention. "You did go about it badly," she agreed, "but the outcome was good, so I find I have forgiven you entirely." She picked up her basket. "Next time you have an idea like that, come to me first." He blinked. "Yes, ma'am," he said with apparent sincerity. She walked out of the store and down the boardwalk, and the afternoon sun was on the main street of Grazer's Flat, and she had lived here 4 years now and knew the sound of the place and the feel of it. And she felt it as hers in the easy, unquestioned way that belonging feels when it has had time to settle. Calvin was waiting with the wagon at the end of the street, Thomas on the seat beside him already asleep against his father's arm in the boneless way of small children, and she climbed up and he moved Thomas gently to make room, and she leaned across and kissed him on the cheek without announcement, which she did sometimes, and which he received with a look of such genuine pleasure that she could never quite stop herself from smiling. "What was that for?" he asked, as he always did. "For being here," she said, as she always said. He clicked the horses forward and they started home, and Thomas stirred and settled again, and the late afternoon sun was long over the grass, and the cottonwood trees along the river road were gold, and then red, and then bare as they drove through the turning year. The winter of 1886 into 1887 was cruel. It was part of a brutal stretch of winters that devastated cattle operations across the northern plains, and the Dawson Ranch was not exempt from the losses, though Calvin's careful management and Mabel's meticulous tracking of the winter stores meant they came through better than many of their neighbors. They lost 11 head, which was a real loss, and the spring of 1887 required a period of rebuilding that was difficult and required selling timber rights from the eastern parcel, the very rights that Harlan Pierce managed, and the transaction required Calvin to sit across a desk from Harlan in circumstances he found grating. But he did it practically and without resentment because that was the only sensible way to proceed. Mabel made sure the house was warm and the food was good and the children felt nothing of the financial pressure, and she kept the accounts with meticulous care, and in the evenings she and Calvin worked through the numbers together and found the path forward, which was narrow but passable. "We'll be all right," she told him, not as encouragement but as fact, on a February night with the wind hammering the north wall and the children asleep upstairs and the lamp burning between them on the table. "I know," he said. "You don't look like you know," she said. He looked up from the ledger. "I look like a man in the middle of a hard winter on a cattle ranch," he said. "Yes," she said. "And also like a man who will come out the other side of it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he put down the pen and leaned across the table and kissed her, which she had not expected and which made her put her hand to his face in the way she always did. "What is that for?" she said. "For being here," he said. She laughed. He smiled, and the lamp burned between them, and the winter raged outside, and none of it was as heavy as it might have been. The spring of 1887 was a relief, and then a reward. The grass came back with the enthusiasm of land that had been stripped and was reclaiming itself, and the Platte ran high and clean, and Calvin moved the surviving herd to the best pasture, and the cattle responded with the bovine contentment of animals in good grass. Pete Harlow had managed through the winter with loyalty and skill that Calvin recognized with a raise and a piece of direct praise that made Pete go slightly red in the face and stand a little taller for the rest of the day. Mabel planted the kitchen garden in April, and by June it was producing in the generous way it did after a cold winter, as if the cold had charged it with latent energy. She had the cool room shelves full by August and was trading preserves with 2 other ranch families along the river road, an informal economy of abundance that gave her genuine satisfaction. Thomas turned 5 in December of 1887 and began to show an interest in learning to read with a focus that surprised everyone, including himself. Mabel began teaching him at the kitchen table in the mornings, working through the reader she had ordered from the catalog, and he applied himself to it with a thoroughness that was entirely his father and a creativity in making up alternative meanings for words that was entirely his mother. Calvin watched these lessons from the doorway sometimes with an expression that made Mabel's heart do something uncomplicated and good. Clara was 2.5 and had developed both speech and opinion simultaneously, which created a domestic environment of considerable liveliness. She had decided that she liked horses better than most people, which Calvin took as a sign of excellent character, and that the best position for any meal was on Calvin's lap, which he accommodated without complaint. "You have completely given way to her," Mabel told him one evening. "I have," he said, perfectly pleasantly, bouncing Clara on his knee while Clara examined a button on his shirt with great concentration. "And I will continue to." "She is going to be absolute chaos," Mabel said. "She is going to be magnificent," Calvin said. Mabel looked at him, at this man who had sent everyone away and then, eventually, had stopped, and she thought about the particular shape of a life that fits the person living it. Thought about 3 rides up a river road, and a door that had finally opened. Thought about everything that had come from that 3rd ride, the not sending away, the ring from his mother's jewelry box, the dance at the schoolhouse, the winter nights and the spring mornings and the children and the land and the long, steady, expanding happiness of a thing that was genuinely and deeply right. "You're thinking something," he said. "I'm always thinking something," she said. "Something particular," he said. She looked at him. "I'm thinking that I'm glad I came back a 3rd time." He was quiet for a moment. Clara had fallen asleep in the interval, which she did with sudden decisiveness, one moment awake and the next completely gone, her small weight solid against his chest. "I'm glad, too," he said. His voice was quiet and completely certain. "I'm glad every day." She got up from her chair and came and sat beside him on the bench by the fire, and he shifted Clara and put his arm around Mabel, and she leaned into him with the ease of 4 years of evenings exactly like this. And the fire was good, and the children were safe, and the land was theirs, built on and tended and ongoing. The years continued to settle around them with the generosity of years well spent. Thomas at 7 was riding his own horse, a calm-tempered bay that Calvin had selected with particular care and that Thomas had named Biscuit, which was not the name anyone had expected but which suited the horse well. He was a serious and steady boy, good with animals, more patient than either parent in some ways, with a quality of focused observation that would serve him well at whatever he turned toward. Clara at 4 was, as predicted, magnificent and chaotic in equal parts. She had decided that she was going to be a horsewoman, which Calvin encouraged, and had also decided that she was going to be in charge of everything, which Mabel managed with a firm and loving hand. She had dark honey hair and her mother's green eyes and her father's square jaw, and the combination was dramatic and absolutely effective. In the spring of 1889, Wyoming Territory moved toward statehood, and the conversations in Grazer's Flat had a particular energy that year, a sense of the region becoming something more formally itself. Calvin and Mabel followed the proceedings with interest, And when Wyoming was admitted to the Union in July of 1890, there was a genuine celebration in town, a whole day of it, with music and food and a great deal of patriotic feeling that was, in this particular territory, mixed with a sort of frontier self-congratulation that Mabel found both understandable and charming. Wyoming was also, notably, the first state to grant women the right to vote in its constitution, a fact that had been true since the territory period in 1869, and that was now carried into statehood. Mabel had voted in the territorial election since she arrived, a right she exercised with what she considered appropriate seriousness, and she had discussed this with Calvin in the early days when she was not yet certain of his opinion, and he had told her that any state or territory that was going to survive and prosper needed all of its people making decisions, and that the alternative was foolish and wasteful, and that he had been raised by a father who held the same view. This was one of the first moments she had thought, clearly and without qualification, that she was in the right place. The summer of 1890 brought a visitor she had not expected. Her brother Joseph Baker arrived from Kansas City with his wife, Ellen, a bright and energetic woman of 30 whom Mabel liked immediately. They came for 3 weeks, which became 4, and the ranch house was full in a way it had not been before. All the bedrooms occupied, the table extended with the extra leaves, noise and conversation from early morning. Calvin, who was by nature a man who kept his company small, managed this with a grace that Mabel privately marveled at, and that she attributed to 4 years of practice in opening himself to the company of others. He and Joseph got on well. They were both practical men who liked direct conversation and could work alongside each other companionably, without needing to fill every moment with words. Joseph watched Calvin and Mabel together with the attention of a brother who had been worried about his sister, and by the end of the first week, the worry was visibly gone from his face, replaced by the easy satisfaction of a man who sees that someone he loves is well and truly loved. "He's a good man," Joseph said to her privately, on a morning when Calvin was out with the cattle and the children were chasing each other around the kitchen garden with Ellen in benign pursuit. "He is," Mabel said. "He looks at you like," Joseph paused, searching for words which was not his strength. "Like you're the fixed point," he said finally, "like everything navigates around where you are." Mabel was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said, "I think that's right." Joseph nodded. "Papa will be glad to hear it. He already knows it from his visits, but he'll be glad to hear you say it." She wrote to her father that evening, a long letter, trying to capture what it felt like to live in this particular life, on this particular land, with this particular man. And she found as she was writing it that the words came easily, because the feeling was clear and deep and required very little translation. Arthur Baker died in the winter of 1891, peacefully and in his sleep, in Joseph's house in Kansas City. He had been in declining health for a year, and had made his peace with it in the manner of a man who had lived fully and without regret. Mabel received the letter from Joseph on a Tuesday, and Calvin found her at the kitchen table with it, and he came and sat beside her and held her hand while she cried, which she did properly and at length, and when she was done, he made her tea, which was not his customary area, but which he managed without comment. She went to Kansas City for the service with Calvin, the first time they had left the ranch together, Pete and Gus managing in their absence, and the children staying with Della Marsh, who had recovered fully from her lung trouble and was genuinely delighted to have them. The service was small and good, attended by people who had known Arthur Baker as a man of steady, honest character, and Mabel spoke at it briefly and well, and afterward Joseph and Ellen fed everyone in their kitchen, and it was a proper goodbye, which was what she needed. On the train back to Wyoming, she sat with her head against Calvin's shoulder and watched the plains open out westward from the window, the land getting bigger and higher and finally settling into the particular wide gravity of Wyoming, and she felt the rightness of returning to it, felt the pull of the ranch and the children and the life, and she thought about all the ways that love works against loss, not to erase it but to make it possible to carry. "I want to plant something for him," she said. "In the spring. Another tree, maybe, by the south fence. A cottonwood," he said. "Something that flowers," she said. He liked things that flowered. "A plum tree," he said after a moment. "They're hardy and they flower in April and they give fruit." "Yes," she said. "A plum tree." And in the spring they planted it together in the good soil by the south fence, a young plum tree from the nursery in Laramie, and it took hold well, and by its second spring was flowering with small white blossoms that filled that corner of the yard with a clean, sweet smell that made Mabel stop and breathe it in every time she passed. Thomas at 9 was a deliberate and thoughtful student of both books and the land, already showing Calvin's aptitude for horses and something of his own, a precise observational quality, a willingness to wait and watch before acting, that seemed to come from some combination of both parents distilled into something new. He was beginning to help with the lighter cattle work, riding the fence line with Calvin on Saturdays, and these Saturday rides were a ritual that both of them protected with the seriousness it deserved. Clara at 7 was reading voraciously, having taken to it later than Thomas but with more intensity, consuming every book in the house and demanding more, which Mabel provided through the catalog and through the small lending library that the church had established. She was also becoming a genuinely skilled young rider, and Calvin had begun teaching her to work with the horses in the deliberate, patient way he did everything, and she absorbed it with a focus that matched his own. The ranch in 1892 was a different thing from the closed, solitary operation it had been a decade earlier. 2,000 acres, well fenced, a good cattle herd, horses that were known in the county for quality, a house that was a home in every sense, a household that was a community unto itself. Mabel looked at it sometimes and felt the weight of what had been built, not just the physical things but the living reality of it, the ongoing project of two people who had chosen each other and kept choosing each other every day. She found Calvin in the barn on a November evening, the golden light of the lantern on the rafters, checking on one of the mares who was close to foaling. He did not hear her come in, and she watched him for a moment, the way she had watched him work from the fence that first spring, that ease in the barn, that particular communication between him and the animals, the same as it had ever been and also deeper now, something that had been practicing itself for a decade. "She's all right," he said without turning. He always knew when she was there. "I know," she said. She came and stood beside him at the stall door. The mare was calm and round and breathing slowly in the lamplight. "I just wanted to see where you were." He put his arm around her. They stood there in the warm barn smell, the mare's easy breathing, the distant sound of the wind outside, the lantern steady in the cold air. "Are you happy?" she asked. It was not a question she asked often because happiness was something she observed rather than measured, but she asked it sometimes because she was a person who believed in the direct question. He was quiet for a moment in his particular way, not reluctant to answer but considering what was true. "Yes," he said, "I am." He turned to look at her in the lamplight, and his face was the face she knew best in the world, every line of it known and loved, changed by time and weather and 10 years of living into something richer and more certain than the guarded face she had first met on a spring doorstep. "I have been for a long time," he said. "I just took a while to admit it." "That is very you," she said. "It is," he agreed without apology. She laughed. He kissed her forehead and then her mouth, warm and steady in the cold barn, and the mare shifted softly in her stall, and the Wyoming night pressed against the barn walls, and Mabel thought, as she had thought many times and would think many times more, that she had come back a third time, and he had not sent her away, and from that small persistent fact this entire life had grown, this warm, enormous specific life, and she was grateful for it in the deep wordless way that you are grateful for the very best things, the things that are so fundamentally right that gratitude feels almost too small a word for what you mean. The plum tree by the south fence flowered every April without fail. The ranch stretched its 2,000 acres along the Platte River, green in summer and gold in autumn, and white in winter, and new every spring. Thomas grew tall and serious and good. Clara grew into herself with a magnificent, focused ferocity that would carry her through whatever she chose. Calvin Dawson, who had sent everyone away and then stopped sending, who had built his wall and let it fall not at once but stone by stone under the pressure of a woman with a firm knock and a stubborn heart, continued every morning to wake to the life he had been afraid to want, and to receive it with the particular gratitude of a man who knows exactly what it cost. And Mabel Baker, who had ridden up a river road 3 times and found on the third try the door finally open, tended that life with everything she had, every morning with the stove going before dawn, every evening with the lamp between them on the table, every season of the wide Wyoming year, the two of them and the children and the land and all the long, good, ordinary days. It was, by any measure, everything. It was entirely enough.